So hello everyone and welcome to our Beginning Apple Grower webinar series. My name is Suzanne Slack. I'm the fruit specialist for Iowa State University. I'll be moderating this session. And today we'll be talking about designing a spray program for disease control. And we have Dr. Leslie Holland from University of Wisconsin-Madison, who is the assistant professor and extension fruit crop pathologist. So Leslie joined the Department of Plant Pathology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison as an assistant professor and extension specialist in fruit crop pathology in 2020. Her research focuses on the biology, epidemiology, and the management of pathogens affecting fruit production in Wisconsin. The goal of her extension program is to optimize and deliver integrated disease management approaches that support the productivity and sustainability of fruit crop production. So just a reminder, please do not unmute yourself during the talk. And if you have any questions, please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen. You can do it anytime during the talk, just so you remember your question, and we'll read them at the end. So just a reminder that this webinar series is brought to you by a four-way state partnership with the UW-Madison Extension's fruit team, the University of Minnesota Extension, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign Extension, and the Iowa State University Extension Program. So with that, I think we can turn it over to Leslie.
Great, thank you so much, Suzanne. I'm just going to share my screen, hopefully, and minimize the window here. Hopefully folks can hear and see me. So thanks for that introduction. Today we're going to be talking about designing a spray program for disease control in apples specifically. There are going to be some considerations in here that you'll also carry over into your planning for any insecticide or herbicide program, but today's focus is purely on disease control in your orchard. So in plant pathology, we always use this disease triangle where we talk about the three factors that contribute to disease, which is a pathogen, host, and a conducive environment. But I think the triangle has a lot of other functions as well. So I'm going to use it today as a kind of template or outline for today's talk. So the three components we're going to cover today in terms of your fungicide program, and I believe all of them are core components, are going to be, of course, number one, the products that you're going to use and how they function against the pathogens. We'll talk about disease scouting and some particular diseases of apple that we typically see in our region here in Wisconsin and in the upper Midwest. And then we'll kind of pair this with apple phenology and when those are critical times to spray based on the susceptibility of those cropping systems. Now, as I mentioned, we're mentioning fungicide sprays, but we're also going to cover fire blight, which I know all of you probably know by now is not a fungal disease, but a bacterial disease. So we will cover that as well. But primarily everything else we deal with in apple disease-wise are going to be fungal pathogens. So before we hop into those details, I do want to cover some important considerations. I think this is really important, especially when you're first starting out. It's oftentimes you might see other orchards that have been at it longer than you, or maybe an orchard that's in a different location than you, and they're going to have different factors. So it's really important that you keep in mind the factors that are going on within your particular orchard. And it's also important to remember that fungicide spray programs are intended to complement integrated disease management tools. So if you aren't using those other practices like cultural practices or the most resistant or tolerant varieties or rootstock, these are meant to be used within your fungicide program, right? It's going to make it stronger. In fact, not doing those things is actually going to ask your fungicide program to work harder and likely not perform as well. We want to target the critical periods for the disease, right? So we want to control the pathogen when it's going to be peaking the most or when it's going to be starting to emerge. Those are going to be critical periods for control. Additionally, as we use these fungicides in the orchard, we really want to aim to minimize the risk for fungicide resistance development. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Keep in mind that spray guides are just recommendations. I will be referencing our Midwest Fruit Pest Management Spray Guide a lot during my discussion today, but these are just recommendations and not prescriptions. Again, you're going to have to take into factors that are going to be perhaps unique at your orchard compared to other orchards. And finally, be aware of incompatibilities between certain chemistries, especially throughout certain times of the growing season for apples as well. And typically you can find this information on your fungicide label, but there's also really great information inside that Midwest pest guide as well. So things that will influence how you design a fungicide program are going to be your orchard and location, right? There's going to be a lot of varying factors that you have to put in consideration as you make these decisions. History of disease is going to be one of those. That's a really important one. If you don't have a history of disease, that's great. That's going to alter your program, and perhaps you might need to not use an intensive approach. If you do have a history of disease, you might need a more intensive approach. Varieties and rootstocks are also going to make a really big deal in the outcomes of how your fungicide programming is going to work. And then, of course, if you have high density plantings or more traditional plantings of apple, that's going to make a huge difference as well, especially for certain diseases that tend to be a bit more prevalent in the high density systems. And overall, really, there's no silver bullet. I think maybe that's a point I can always lead with, and there's no silver bullet. Despite the fact that we're talking about fungicide programming today, you really want to use an integrated practice. So the first thing we'll talk about is disease scouting. I'm going to cover some of the main diseases that we typically encounter in this area, or we have conducive conditions for, and perhaps we don't always see as much. I will be also sharing QR codes. They'll be kind of small on some of the slides, and these are just supplemental information articles that have been written that have come out through our fruit newsletter on the particular topic of that slide. So those are there for you all as supplemental information because I only have an hour to cover information today. So the first disease we will cover is Phytophthora crown and root rot. Typical symptoms you will see with this is going to be a general decline of the tree. I will note, and that's pictured here on the right of the right photos here. I will note that rapid decline can occur on varieties that are particularly susceptible to Phytophthora crown and root rot. Additionally, certain environmental conditions like heat can really trigger the symptom expression for Phytophthora as well. So this is something to keep in mind, but it tends to look kind of like this whole tree decline. Additionally, if you were to cut the bark off near the crown and then into the root tissue, you would notice this necrosis, and it would be a margin between healthy tissue and this necrotic or dead tissue. And this is pretty common for those crown and root rots that we observe. The Phytophthora pathogen itself actually persists in the soil for a really long time. It can be introduced on contaminated soil, planting stock, and as well as contaminated water as well. So these are potential sources of introduction of this pathogen to the orchard. And cultural management practices really include limiting soil saturation. And this is important because this particular pathogen is quite mobile in water. So avoiding periods of complete saturation, or if you have an orchard with low spots, that is oftentimes a place where we might see more Phytophthora. So encouraging good drainage or selecting a site that has good drainage is going to be really important in terms of disease control for Phytophthora. Additionally, things you can do, you can either try and maintain or improve soil structure so that it is better draining. And then, of course, lean into resistant rootstocks. And there's several resources online that cover these different rootstocks and their varying resistance or susceptibility to Phytophthora as well as other diseases of apple. Next is apple scab, probably one of the most important diseases of apple. And this particular disease has symptoms on both the fruit and the leaves of our apples. We typically see them on leaves first. They can start out as almost fuzzy green looking spots that eventually morph into darker looking spots as pictured to the right here. Fruit, we tend to see a similar colored spot, but this is where we get that scab name from. The lesions look very scabby on the fruit. An important thing for apple scab to also note is that something like crabapple and some other species and the rose family are host to apple scab fungal pathogen. So if your orchard is surrounded by a bunch of crab apples or perhaps an orchard that hasn't been well maintained, that could be another potential source of inoculum in your orchard. Now, the pathogen does overwinter on fallen infected leaves. So at the end of the season, once leaves have fallen on the orchard floor, this is often a really great source of that pathogen to potentially reemerge in the following spring if that pathogen source is not managed. And so we'll talk about this a little bit more with our spray programs as well. The pathogen does move with rain and wind movement, and this is the primary inoculum in the early part of the season, right as those buds start to open up. In terms of cultural management, plant-resistant varieties is going to be really key. This is, I think, a strategy most growers use, but we also have fungicides that are effective against the scab pathogen as well. Sanitation, we'll talk a little bit more about that, as well as pruning to improve air circulation in the canopy. And this is going to be a really great tool for probably most of the fruit and foliar diseases that we talk about, because that air circulation is going to create an environment that's going to allow things to more rapidly dry, which will be less conducive to most of the fungal pathogens growing. So fire blight, perhaps a close second to apple scab, although in some years it's probably in first place in terms of really severe diseases of apple. So symptoms, it's a really well-named disease, I would say. It looks like fire has moved through the orchard in really severe cases. This pathogen is a bacterial pathogen, not fungal, and it impacts the shoots, the leaves, can infect the blossoms, the fruits, branches, and rootstocks as well, those susceptible rootstocks in particular. What we typically see is a necrosis or dead tissue, again, kind of that burnt look, the kind of in the photo you see here to the right. We also see things like cankers, which is on the bottom right of the screen. These cankers, we oftentimes call them holdover cankers. When they're in this lignified tissue, they survive through the winter in this particular state and can serve as a source of inoculum in new and subsequent seasons. Additionally, we see oozing sometimes. This is typically dependent upon environmental conditions. If it's particularly humid out, you'll see that ooze, which is just a bunch of bacterial cells kind of clumped together. It's hard to see here, but there is some oozing on this particular photo in the top right on some blighted blossoms. As I mentioned, this pathogen does overwinter in those holdover cankers, so your winter pruning practices to remove these are going to be really critical. Rain and wind also move the pathogen during the growing season. When you have that ooze, it can quickly move and infect new emerging succulent tissues. In terms of cultural management practices, as I mentioned, that sanitation is quite critical to prune out any cankers. Summer sanitation is also going to involve the removal of shoot blight strikes. And I've got some more detailed information about that with a QR code based on a discussion I had with George Sundin at Michigan State University, who's led a lot of research in fire blight management. Additionally, there are several resistant or low susceptibility cultivars and rootstocks that are available for fire blight. Powdery mildew. This is one that we traditionally had not seen too much of in Wisconsin, but last year was quite the exception to that. The symptoms of this disease are, again, well named. Powdery growth we typically see on the leaves. Oftentimes on the underside of the leaves, we'll see this growth, and the leaves will curl up in response, and then they kind of, we call them flag shoots, right? They kind of bring our attention to the fact that something's infected, and they tend to have almost a silver gray appearance. Now, this pathogen overwinters in buds, and this brings me back to the reason why we don't oftentimes see it in a place like Wisconsin, where we have very cold temperatures. These very cold temperatures oftentimes do not allow this fungus to survive in the bud. So if in times that we do see powdery mildew, it's typically going to follow a more mild winter. And last season was a season that followed a mild winter, and we did see powdery mildew in some orchard blocks in Wisconsin. In terms of cultural management, selecting resistant varieties, again, is going to be critical for this. And unfortunately, sanitation is not always feasible during the growing season. I think recommendations are if you have younger trees with fewer infections, that's probably feasible in terms of that manual sanitation removal of infections. But on a larger scale, it's not always feasible. But we do have fungicide chemistries that can help control this disease. Bitter rot and summer rots, as you can probably tell, you're seeing more fruit in the photos. So we're getting towards kind of diseases that we typically see a little bit later in the season. And I've clustered these together. These are caused by different fungal pathogens. There is some overlap in symptomology, but it is important to know that these diseases or manifestations are caused by different pathogens. So bitter rot is probably one of the leading, more important ones within this group of fruit rots that we're talking about, but folks still see other manifestations like black rot as well as white rot. So they typically cause these lesions that are sunken on the fruits. They affect both the skin and the flesh of the fruit, and so that's important. If you were to cut the fruits open, sometimes you see that movement of that dead tissue towards the core of the apple. Most of the pathogens that are associated with these different fruit rots do overwinter in other host tissues. So it could be in a branch canker, it could be in a mummified fruit. They have different avenues of overwintering in those tissues and causing new infections this following season if not managed. Infection timing, of course, is going to vary by pathogens, but the fruits do seem to be susceptible throughout the growing season. So if you are seeing a lot of fruit infections, sanitation is going to become incredibly important as infections can continue to happen. And this includes removal of infected fruits, as well as any dead branches or cankered branches. In fact, sometimes for some of these pathogens, especially black rot in particular, this fungus will form on dead or dying branches that previously had fire blight infection. So it's really that sanitation is going to be really critical to management. Thinning practices, fruit thinning practices specifically will help reduce that conducive environment. And then removing any prunings from the orchard is also going to reduce the amount of inoculum that's very close to those healthy tissues that we don't want infected. And finally, in the disease that we'll cover today, before we hop into some of the chemistries, is going to be sooty blotch and fly speck, or SBFS, as it's often seen in articles. The symptoms of this are divided by each of the different respective disease complexes. These are caused by a multitude of different fungi. The sooty blotch are simply dark blotches on the fruit, pictured to the right here. They almost just look like little smudges of dirt on the fruit. And the fly speck is just almost freckled or specks clustered together on the fruit. The growth of these fungi are very superficial, so they only impact the skin. They don't actually impact the flesh of the fruit like we saw with some of the fruit rots before. These fungi overwinter on fruits, twigs, and leaves of other host plants. And this can include something like, of course, apple, but also pear. And infections typically begin in late May into early June. For the most part, sooty blotch and fly speck is a cosmetic issue. However, it can lower the quality of fruits. So it's still an important issue, but not as destructive as we tend to see with some of the other fruit rots or other fungal diseases. In terms of cultural management, practices, again, that promote good air circulation in the canopy are going to be really critical. So that was a quick review of some diseases, but I want to get into talking about some of the chemistries now. This is not an exhaustive list by any means. I've tried to group here by some common frac groups that we tend to use throughout the season in apple. And I want to emphasize to all of you to make sure that you're reading the label for instructions, as well as consulting the pest management guide for efficacy data. So the first group of fungicides we'll talk about are the multi-site mode of action fungicides, oftentimes FRAC-M, which you'll see on the tables or on the label as well. Things include mancozeb, captan, zyram, copper, and sulfur. Their efficacy tends to be pretty good in general. It, of course, will vary for certain pathogens, and keep in mind that not all of these different chemistries are registered for all fungal pathogens. For instance, sulfur is great for powdery mildew, but captan and mancozeb are not registered for powdery mildew control in apple. So important to read the label to know those differences. In terms of the pre-harvest interval, it's quite variable across these chemistries. Again, you'll want to check the label or the pest management guide for this information. 77 days for mancozeb is quite extensive, while 0 days for captan, right? So knowing the difference in these is going to really help you design your fungicide program appropriately so that you can avoid those pre-harvest intervals. Important considerations, as I just mentioned, the longer PHIs are really going to be important, especially as you start to think about late season control, what may or may not be an option for you. And resistance risk, and what I mean by this is for fungicide resistance development, is low for this particular class of fungicides. However, low risk does not mean no risk. So something to keep in mind here. So mode of action, we're going to talk about respiration. This is respiration of the fungus in particular. We've got FRAC7, which are SDHI fungicides, as we typically refer to them. I've listed a couple examples for you there that we use in apple. Again, not an exhaustive list. These are rated as good to excellent for powdery mildew, scab fungi, as well as rust fungi. We didn't talk about rust fungi. We can certainly talk about them later. They sometimes are an issue in orchards, but they tend to be well managed with a lot of the control products that we currently use that are targeting other diseases. The PHI for these products is going to vary, but anywhere from 7 to 14 days. There are important considerations for FRAC7 and a lot of these other FRAC groups is that a lot of these chemistries are part of premixtures. So what I mean is that you might have a chemistry that's FRAC7 plus FRAC3 or frac 7 plus frac 11, right? And so those count as the use of that frac group. Just because they're in a premixture, you're still using that frac group. So this is going to come into play when we talk about something like sequential applications of something. You're still using that frac group, even though it's in combination with another frac group. And these particular fungicides are in the medium to high risk group. Our frac 11s are what we call strobilurins or QOIs. A couple examples listed there. Very effective for our bitter rot, powdery mildew scab, summer rots, and sooty blotch and fly speck complex. Variable PHI, about 2 weeks for several products. And again, that same issue again with the premixtures. We see frac 11 in a lot of premixtures, and there tend to be a limited number of applications you're able to make according to the label. So something to pay attention to. And part of the reason for that is because these are high risk for fungicide resistance development. So for a frac 3 or sterile biosynthesis inhibitors, we've got a couple examples there, Sevia, Indar, Procure, Rally. Efficacy tends to be pretty good to excellent, I would say, for many of these for powdery mildew, rust, scab, sooty blotch, and fly speck. Although there are limited products, I would say, in this frac 3 class, specifically either effective or registered for sooty blotch and fly speck. PHI, again, check out that label to see as it's going to vary per product. We do see frac 3 in numerous premixtures. An example of that would be an Inspire Super, and these are considered medium risk for fungicide resistance development. So amino acid and protein synthesis, this is frac 9. This is another frac group we commonly see used for fungal disease control in apple. And examples of this are going to be Vanguard and Scala. These products in particular, and you will see this within the pest management guide, but it's important to note that particularly Vanguard and Scala are most effective at temperatures below 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So that again is going to play into how you select chemistries throughout the growing season, right, based on some of those environmental conditions. They perform good to excellent for apple scab. PHI is going to vary, so check the label. And again, frac 9 is found in some premixtures for apple with a medium risk for fungicide resistance development. The final category here I'm going to cover in our chemistries before we start talking about now actually putting this together and planning a fungicide program are going to be the products that control fire blight specifically. As I mentioned, this is a bacterial pathogen, so the chemistries that we have available are going to be quite different than those we see for fungal diseases. So examples of this are agromycin, which is streptomycin sulfate, apogee, which is a plant growth regulator. There's various copper products, cusumin, which is also an antibiotic, as well as mycoshield or fireline. These again are kind of manufacturer names for these different products. And that's also a antibiotic, and they kind of span different frac groups as well. So the efficacy of these products is quite good for fire blight and excellent, I would actually say, for streptomycin is the best product for fire blight control. However, there are some caveats with that as streptomycin resistance has emerged in several apple production regions. Now, the PHI is quite variable. I think for something like our oxytetracycline, mycoshield, for instance, is about 6 days, where some of the other antibiotics are going to be 50 to 90 days. But you should be using antibiotics during that bloom. So it's going to be earlier in the season, right? This is when we're first trying to target the blossom blight phase of fire blight. Important considerations of this, again, are going to be following any instructions in the label, as well as resistance to streptomycin, I mentioned, has been detected in several production regions. So this is going to be good to have this information as you make decisions about what you're going to apply to manage. And the resistance risk is typically medium to high for this group of chemistries. So a quick note on fungicide resistance development, because even if you're just starting out and growing apples and working with your first orchard, this is a really great approach to take as you start, like not waiting until 5 or 10 years in. This is something we have to think about from the forefront when it comes to managing diseases, but also managing the longevity of the products that we have available to us, as we've already lost some, unfortunately. So how does fungicide resistance develop? It starts with highly susceptible varieties under very favorable environmental conditions. That's one big factor. Improper timing of fungicide application can also really be a negative factor when it comes to developing resistance. So you're going to really want to focus applying again for those critical periods. So if you're making applications after spore dispersal events have already happened, you're not actually targeting what you're setting out to target. Again, keeping an eye on plant phenology is going to be huge, and we'll talk about that in this last section of the presentation here, as well as looking at disease forecast models, and I'll mention a couple of those that are available for apple diseases. Applications of fungicides after an epidemic is certainly what we don't want to see either. What happens in this scenario is that you're applying a lot of fungicide to a huge population of a pathogen, right? And so when a pathogen's exposed, a large population of the pathogen is exposed, it's likely that there's going to be survivorship of some of those pathogens or some of those isolates, if you will, that will then continue to persist and have those resistance mutations. When improper fungicide rate is applied, this is also an issue, which is why we always encourage you to stick with the rates that are listed on the fungicide label. And typically, if you're dealing with a disease that's quite aggressive, use the higher end of the label rate, right? In low conducive situations, right, you have a low history, that's fine to use that lower end of the label rate. But if we're dealing with conducive conditions and you have a history of the disease, the higher end on that range on your label is what you're going to want to use, right? And finally, we'll talk about this probably ad nauseum, but repeated use of that same fungicide or same mode of action is going to be quite detrimental and really speed up that process to fungicide resistance development. And our goal is really to delay that process. So in this last section here, I'm going to spend some time walking through how we can go about having a disease prevention program using our various fungicide chemistries at the different phenological stages of our apple trees. So the first that we'll come across is that dormancy to silver tip period. I've got some photos here as a reference. So hopefully, I know some folks around Wisconsin are still at this phase, but I know folks are starting to emerge beyond this. So the season is upon us. The key diseases you're going to be worrying about at this growth stage are going to be fire blight. So oftentimes those overwintering cankers. Scab, that primary inoculum specifically, and then Phytophthora crown and root rot if this is an issue in your particular area, kind of really based on the soils that you're growing on. So in terms of prevention and control, if fire blight was a big issue for you in the previous year, something like a fixed copper can be applied at silvertip that can help kind of mitigate that moving into that season. Copper at this stage can also help with apple scab in orchards where disease pressure was high in previous seasons. Keep in mind, though, if you're using this option for fire blight at the beginning of the season, this does not mean that you do not need to necessarily use a control product during bloom. Bloom is going to be an incredibly critical time, so it's still incredibly necessary for you to use an antibiotic at bloom to manage fire blight. In the situation of Phytophthora, Rinamol products are available that can be applied to the soil in the spring before the growth starts to help mitigate Phytophthora infections. Urea applications are also a practice use. They can be used sometimes at the end of the previous season or the beginning of the spring for those apple scab, for those leaves that are on the orchard floor with those overwintering inoculum of that pathogen. So as we move through the season and we start getting to green tip through half-inch green, right? So a bit of a shorter period here. We're shifting focus a little bit to powdery mildew and scab. I do want to mention primary inoculum for both. Conditions for scab and powdery mildew are going to be quite different, and we typically don't see them both really take off in the same season. For scab in particular, we tend to see that in our rainier seasons, which I would say is probably more characteristic for some place like Wisconsin where I'm based. And in seasons where we just have humidity but not a ton of rain or very mild winter, we're going to see more of that powdery mildew. So again, it's not likely that you're going to see a really intense outbreak of both in your orchard. Again, that also might depend on certain varieties and their susceptibility as well. In terms of disease prevention, fungicide applications should begin at green tip for apple scab. This is critical. The next slide, we'll talk briefly about a model that's available to help you make those decisions in your orchard. Captozeb is a hybridization of this Captain and Mancozeb words, but really it's a tank mix. It's a very highly recommended tank mix that can be used during this part in the growing season and even past that to help manage a lot of these fungal diseases. It is not recommended to apply copper after quarter-inch green leaf stage or when drying conditions are going to be cool and slow, because this is going to increase your risk for phytotoxicity. So you really want to be careful with copper products after this point. And again, if you're dealing with powdery mildew, sulfur applications can be used. You'll have to be mindful of the label and how the product is actually formulated. Some apple varieties are also going to be sensitive to sulfur, so this is something to be aware of with the varieties that you're growing. And of course, you're going to want to check your label for incompatibilities and any environmental condition restrictions. And what I mean by that is when temperatures typically exceed 80, 85, when it's quite hot outside, you can deal with more issues of phytotoxicity with sulfur applications. Additionally, there are some incompatibilities with things like oil and captain. And again, this information is on the label. So I mentioned disease models. What we recommend and encourage folks to use are the models that are built in through NUA, and there's a model for apple scab in this. And so these predictions begin at green tip. So this is really important information for you to record in your orchard, keeping in mind that it may vary by variety. So you can take this information and plug it into NUA, where they'll have different stations, hopefully one close in your area. And it's going to look at ascospore maturity, as well as the discharge daily of these ascospores. And ascospores are the primary inoculum, right? So this is the early season, how these infections are beginning. It's also going to look at that cumulative discharge of the spores, as well as environmental conditions to build out a prediction for you when sprays are going to be most critical for control. As we move into tight cluster through pink, so tight cluster is hopefully roughly 7 days after half-inch green, and then pink will be another perhaps 7 to 10 days after that. Key diseases that you'll be concerned about are scab, rust, powdery mildew. And this, I should add, is a really critical period of control for these pathogens. When it comes to control, fungicide control, tank mixing is going to be your friend in these situations. We really want to avoid as much as possible using these single site mode of action fungicides solo in the field. Tank mixing is going to be the best option in terms of fungicide resistance management, as well as mancozeb is still early in the season and a great product to use for these diseases in particular. You want to avoid making more than 2 sequential applications of any fungicide within each group. So you don't want to do back-to-back of frac 3, frac 3, frac 3. You want to mix that and you want to rotate other fungicides, other modes of action, right? Again, we're talking about mitigating fungicide resistance development. Apogee can actually start at this stage as well at 1 to 3 inch shoot growth. And this is to control growth of the shoots by also reducing the risk of fire blight, because fire blight likes those young, quickly emerging green tissues. And these applications can continue later on into the season, and we'll touch on those here in a minute. So bloom. 3 red stars for fire blight. This is going to be a very critical period as these flowers are highly susceptible to the bacterial pathogen. Bitter rot and summer rots can also start to be managed at this stage as well in your orchard. As I mentioned, streptomycin is going to be the most effective antibiotic for blossom blight control. However, we do acknowledge that resistance has been detected in several production regions. And so if streptomycin resistance has been detected in your orchard or in your region, it's recommended to utilize one of the other antibiotics like Fisumin or or Fireline or MycoShield, or other options available to you to manage this disease. Sprays for fire blight should start at the first sign of open blossoms, right? This is when things can quickly take off. So it's important to get a handle on this disease up front. Repeat sprays can be made at 4 to 5 day intervals. However, I encourage you to keep an eye on the models. We dealt with a pretty severe fire blight outbreak in 2021 here in Wisconsin, and those repeat spray intervals were actually quite shorter, I would say, than 4 to 5 days. So this is where that model is going to come in handy, and I'll show that on my next slide here. Really, minimum of 2 applications of your antibiotic or streptomycin is going to be necessary, and we really want to encourage you to use max label rates. I would also then limit your applications of streptomycin to no more than 3 per season, and only use during bloom, because again, we don't want to encourage any resistance to develop. And again, as I mentioned, you can start your bitter rot and summer rot control now, as this will be a critical time to get ahead of those pathogens as they start taking off at this period. So prediction models. Oh, that should actually say fire blight. I do apologize for that. But again, these are also going to be found in NUA. So this is fire blight specific. This is a screenshot I took almost 2 years ago now for one of our stations here in Madison, Wisconsin, and it's got these different colors here. And I guess you can see that, you go from green to yellow, orange to red, increasing in intensity, right? And in terms of those recommendations, it's recommended that your EIP, if it's greater than 70, that's typically a good time to make that application. Now, the models do overpredict infection risk, but I think that's probably to your benefit, right, as quickly as the season moves. So take the information with a grain of salt in that sense, but if conditions are really conducive, you're seeing back-to-back red, it's really important that you're making those applications. For those of you who are new to NUA, I've included a QR link that you can kind of go through an article that was put together on our Fruit newsletter that talks about how the new version of NUA can be used. Now, the prediction models are great. They do identify the risk of infection based on weather conditions, but they certainly do not replace in-field observations of plant phenology or scouting. So please, this should be a holistic program. They also don't predict control failures or future diseases. So this is something to keep in mind, right? It's important to be out in your orchard knowing your particular situation. Weather conditions can change quickly, which means the predictions will also change quickly. The 1 and 2 day forecasts, especially for fire blight in particular, tend to be the most reliable. If you didn't have fire blight last season, or you don't have a history of fire blight, then there's no need to make unnecessary applications of antibiotic to your orchard. So this is something to know about your particular case. And again, these factors are also going to vary based on the age of your orchard, whether you're high density or not, the variety, and the rootstock as well. So petal fall. We're now moving into some of the later season diseases like our bitter rot, summer rots, as well as fire blight is still something to be aware of and managing for at this time. So again, you can still start your program for bitter rot and summer rot control. In fact, if you're still using mancozeb applications for that extended control period of scab, this is actually just going to go ahead and provide some collateral control of bitter rot and summer rots. At this point in the season, it's likely that you're doing perhaps some complex tank mixes in order to manage your fungal diseases and probably other pests in the orchard. So keeping in mind that anything tank mixed with Captain, you need to follow the label instructions because certain things can be phytotoxic at this stage. Antibiotics should continue until all the petals have fallen off, especially for those susceptible varieties. So we're heading into our summer and our first and our second cover sprays, if you will. We've got scab, the fruit rots, rust, powdery mildew, and sooty blotch and fly speck are the key diseases at this particular growth stage. And really, your program's not going to change entirely much. The big thing at this point in the season, as you've already made several sprays to control diseases, is making sure that you're rotating those modes of actions and avoiding those sequential applications of the same frac group or mode of action. For your pre-harvest interval, this is another time to start thinking about that. For a lot of the commonly used chemistries, the PHI can range from 28 to 77 days. So really be aware of this as you select your chemistries moving forward. And this will be especially critical on some of those earlier varieties that folks are growing. Additionally, see the fungicide label and the fruit pest management guide for specific warnings about use patterns of fungicides at this time of the year, as some fungicides can no longer be used after a certain phenological stage, the risk for phytotoxicity, and any tank mix incompatibilities. Additionally, powdery mildew applications after this stage really depend on scouting and your orchard history. If you don't have a history, it's likely that continued applications targeted toward powdery mildew won't be necessary. And if you are going to make applications because you do have powdery mildew that you've scouted, if you're using sulfur, you're going to want to avoid using those at hot weather, like over 80 degrees, so you don't have to have any issues with phytotoxicity. Another model is for sooty blotch and fly speck, again hosted on NUA. These predictions typically begin at petal fall, so a couple phenological stages back there. This particular model looks at the days since petal fall, accumulated leaf wetness hours, and rain events. And there was an article written by Patty McManus several years ago about some of the different model parameters for this particular model for sooty blotch and fly speck, and that can be found with the scan of the QR code. So we're rounding the corner here, getting towards the probably so soon to be the tail end of the season. I know there's several cover sprays after this, but this will kind of guide you through the rest of the season in terms of disease management. And again, our focus will still be scab, our different fruit rot diseases, powdery mildew if that's an issue, and sooty blotch and fly speck again. So kind of more thinking about the cosmetic, but also the diseases that interfere with the actual flesh of the fruit at this point in the season. Unfortunately, rainfall is common this time of the year, and this is going to heavily impact your reapplication interval. So this is something to keep in mind. Additionally, making this a little bit more complicated as we head further into the season, especially for early varieties, is that you're going to be turning your focus towards perhaps you have a U-pick operation, or you're starting your harvest operation. And so when we tend to gear up for those things, other operations such as our fungicide sprays probably take a back seat, understandably so. However, if you are getting that rainfall, it's important to keep up with that and continue to manage your fungicide sprays throughout the season. At this point in the season, mancozeb is likely not going to be a feasible option due to that extensive PHI. However, Captain is very effective against the fruit rot pathogens, and it does work very well in tank mixes with Topsin. And this is especially true for that sooty blotch and fly speck disease complex. One other thing I will mention that we experienced here in Wisconsin last season that it sounds like other folks were observing, I know a couple folks in Minnesota as well, was apple blotch, which I think formerly was called maybe Marsanina, or went under a different name, but apple blotch, no matter, was something that we encountered here towards the end of last season. And again, I think this actually had to do with the fact that we had quite a few late season rains in both August and September. And so there was likely a gap in coverage of our fungicides, and we saw this disease break out in several orchards. It causes a blotch kind of spot on the leaves, somewhat similar to apple scab, but we also saw some orchards that had actual fruit infections as well. So this is something that seems to be a newer thing we need to keep on our radars here in this region, and really following through not only with early season control, so some of that same timing we would be using for apple scab, but also additional coverage later in the season as we head closer to harvest, making sure we're not having any gaps, especially after those periods of rain. So I'll bring everyone's attention to some resources that are great to utilize. One, probably what all of us specialists in this area utilize, is the Midwest Fruit Pest Management Guide. This is the most updated version, and this is available online for free in a PDF version. You can also purchase a version of paper copy as well, if that's your preference. I couldn't find a more up-to-date grower's guide to organic apple production, but this is one from Cornell. It's gotten a little old now, but the information is still quite valuable. And again, I'll leave you with this, which is the slide I showed you in the beginning in terms of planning your fungicide program for your orchard. The considerations stay the same. While we all have access, for the most part, to the same chemistries and cultural practices, how you use them, how you determine that you need to use them, is going to depend heavily on your particular operation. So with that, I tried to leave some decent time for questions because I saw quite a bit coming through the chat. So I will take any questions. And
thanks, Leslie. That was great. We'll get into questions, but we also have a survey for attendees to answer too. So let's take a minute before questions. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. We have quite a few already going on. So answer the poll, and then we'll start with the questions in like 2 minutes. All right, we'll leave that up. So if you please haven't filled out the poll, it really helps us develop these webinar series. So we appreciate any feedback that you can give us, but let's get started on some questions. So there was definitely some discussion, a little bit about what's PHI. Someone else answered that in the chat, so pre-harvest interval. So let's talk a little bit about cedar apple rust. There's a lot of discussion and questions about cedar apple rust in the chat. So the first question was, can copper sprays for cedar apple rust, should those be sprayed during green tip?
Should copper sprays be during green tip for cedar apple rust? I don't know how effective copper is for cedar apple rust. I don't know if you know that, Suzanne, either, but my impression.
Yeah, my impression is not good. I think sulfur is a better control for cedar apple rust than copper, from my experience.
Yep, I would agree with that. Yeah, I've not seen copper be incredibly effective against that, so I just wouldn't use it as a chemistry period. I would say anything after that green tip period in apple is going to run the risk of phytotoxicity for copper in general, so I would just not use it beyond that point. It should really be that really early season selection of that product.
So more about cedar apple rust, just what do you do in general about cedar apple rust?
So the chemistries we do have available, and I can pull up the slides again too, if that's helpful to talk about what's effective. I'd say use your fungicide sprays. You can get varieties that are resistant or pretty low susceptibility to cedar apple rust. That's a great approach for your management as well. Of course, cedar apple rust, they have alternate host. And so if you have those hosts nearby, so things like juniper, those are going to be potentially problematic issues for you because they're also host of that same fungal pathogen. So removing those or making your site selection in areas where those pathogens don't exist or have their alternate host available.
Next question is, what time during open bloom is there a better time of day to spray to avoid pollinators?
Oh, that's a great question. You know, Suzanne, I might put that to you so Suzanne is our fire blight expert. I will say Suzanne did her PhD work on fire blight. So I would assume avoiding pollinators is probably the best, but maybe I'll leave that to you, Suzanne.
Yeah, generally for when there's blossoms out, we want to hit it at night. So late evening, night. There's been some talk about doing morning, but bees, especially honeybees, can start foraging pretty much as soon as light comes out. Your best bet is hitting it in the evening, especially if you're worried about pollinators, but you'll also have better fire blight control if you hit it in the evening too.
That's right. I know the cells of the bacteria seem to really accumulate high in the evening, don't they? So.
Exactly. So let's see, there's a trail here. Let's see. What is the minimal time I can use sulfur after spraying with copper and oil? So they want to do 2 dormant oil and copper sprays now before quarter green tip, but then how long should they wait for a sulfur?
I would check the label. I would say definitely at least 10 days, but some of that's also going to depend on environmental conditions too. So even if you're 10 days out, but the weather is going to be incredibly hot, you're not going to want to put sulfur on, or at least not while it's particularly warm, as that's going to cause phytotoxicity. So, and again, it's also going to depend on the formulation of sulfur that you use. So this information is going to be best determined by the label that you're using, of the product that you're using. And I'll just, before I answer the next question, that I didn't talk a lot about organics today, so a comment in there about that. I primarily stuck to conventional. Organic production is possible. I believe it is very challenging, and there are materials that are available, which is why I shared that guide with you, especially for fire blight. There's been a lot of really phenomenal work on fire blight in terms of organic management, and I'm happy to share those resources with this group today, maybe in a link when we post the recording. So it is feasible. It is a bit more challenging with some of the other fungal diseases. So the best option is typically going to be looking at those resistant varieties and resistant rootstocks for your organic production systems.
Oh, those are good. That's a good, I didn't mention the comment about that, so that's good, pointing that out. One of the other questions was so apples are typically planted in a monoculture, and the question is, if apples are part of a multi-story planting, might they do better? So
That's a great.
Yeah, they're thinking like elderberries, pollinator-friendly flowers.
You know, I think it could be yes or no, depending upon do better in what circumstance, right? I think if you have other plants that are going to, encourage pollinator activity or other beneficial things for apple, it can be really great. I think if you have something that's going to shade out apple, that could be problematic, or anything that's going to cause a more humid microclimate, that could be problematic. So I think it's just going to depend on the plants that you choose to use. I would say some of the fungal pathogens, like we talked about, the rust, do have more extensive host ranges than just apple. And so if you are going to go about this system, I would just recommend that you look into selecting plants that do not have any overlap in terms of the host range of those particular pathogens that we tend to see. Phytophthora is another one. It has a pretty broad host range. So you're going to want to be mindful about that too if you're selecting different host plants. So I think there are probably benefits more than I'm presently aware of. But I would just say, as you're making those selections, think about potential alternate hosts for other pathogens, as well as what kind of potential microclimate would be created, especially if that's going to lead to more conducive conditions for disease development.
I think that's all the questions that we saw. Double check. Very active chat.
Yes, it was. I could see it. It's always hard to talk, and I just want to click in the chat and talk with you all in real time. So
someone did make a comment that they had some phytotox issues with Flint Extra and Captan on Empire. And I haven't heard that one specifically, but there is some cultivar specificity with some of these phytotox interactions for sure.
Yep, that's true. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know if there's a formal table in the guide that talks about that, but there's certainly, that would definitely be something we should add in at some point in the future. But there are occasionally notes where we have picked up on things like certain varieties that tend to be more susceptible to those phytotox issues. Yeah.
If there's no other questions, we have the polls done, but thanks everyone for coming. Thank you, Leslie. That was a great presentation.
Thanks, everyone. Feel free to reach out with more questions if folks have them.
Yeah, and for those, I'll drop it in the chat again, but this webinar will be available on YouTube at the Wisconsin Fruit YouTube channel as well in a couple of days. So feel free to check back on it.